Hello! So I chose to cover the 1995 film Dead Man Walking. It was a pretty quick pick for me, not only because it's a very interesting subject to explore, but also because I'm more than just a little bit partial to Susan Sarandon's acting. So let's get into it. So, in this film, a man named Matthew Poncelet has been put on death row after he's been convicted of two murders and the rape of a teenage girl, and he calls on the local Catholic Church for help, not necessarily to be saved, but for assistance with his appeal because he's still maintaining his innocence. The person who ends up going is a Catholic nun named Helen Prejean, who has never really been in this situation before, but she's ultimately tasked by the Catholic Church to help Matthew absolve himself before his death. But over the course of the film, Helen is doing everything she can to accommodate him while he's on death row. I mean, she gets him a lawyer, she tries to get the governor of Virginia to take him off of death row, but even though in the end none of these things work, she still serves as a support system until the very end of the film when Matthew does receive the lethal injection, but only after he has absolved himself and admitted to his crimes in his last sitting with Helen. This film is also based off of a true story, so the characters and events are very real. So the film then opens up to a discussion that has been going on for an extremely long time, and that is the death penalty moral? I've heard all kinds of arguments on this issue. It's still very much a prevalent issue today, but I think that what it ultimately comes down to is a question of the validity of universal rights, but also divine command theory, which is admittedly a factor I hadn't thought about until after I watched the film. So let's start with universal rights. There are a number of documents that I could pull from to articulate this point, but I think the ones that we are most familiar with are probably the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the U.S. Constitution's Eighth Amendment. Basically, these two documents support the concept that all humans have the right to life, freedom, and personal security, so naturally, by extension, no human is to be subject to quote-unquote cruel or unusual punishment. But then we have to address the age-old question, what is cruel and unusual punishment? It's an extremely vague concept, but when you start to think about the extreme physical and psychological effects that the death penalty has not only on convicted felons, but also those close to them, you can start to see how the death penalty could fall into that admittedly vague concept. But then we also have to address society's desire for retribution, or this eye for an eye concept, which is probably the most common argument I hear that supports the death penalty. And that's exactly where the conflict lies. Is the right to retribution more important than the right to life? Can the death penalty really ever be justified when it trespasses on an individual's rights? It's also problematic because we're punishing an individual with the very thing that they are to be punished for. So then we come to divine command theory. Now I'm reaching way back into the course for this one, but I'll reiterate here that one of the key concepts of divine command theory is that God's commands always override moral principles when there's a conflict, because as a supreme being, all that God does and instructs is moral, no matter what. So then we have to think about some of God's commands, one of them being that it's wrong to kill, unless God says it isn't. This really caught my attention because it was a point that was discussed in the film, which is where we come back to that whole eye for an eye thing, because as the film mentions, according to the Old Testament of the Bible, it was acceptable to, for example, punish a murderer by putting them to death. But it's contradictory because God's law says it's wrong to kill. So if we're looking to lead by example, I've got some bad news. Now, being that this is a film about the criminal justice system, it's chock full of ethical dilemmas, but I think it's convenient that this is the retelling of a story about a Catholic nun and a convict because it does allow us to see those universal rights and divine command theory issues. All in all, this film gave me a very sobering perspective into a very modern issue and definitely helped me think about it in ways that I hadn't before. And roll the sources. That's all I have for you. Bye!